The Bataan Death March, 1942. By 1941, the Empire of Japan was nearing its territorial extent, as much of eastern and southeastern Asia was either under control or targeted by the Japanese. On the 7th of December 1941, Pearl Harbor in the then U.S. territory of Hawaii was attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire. This brought the United States into the Second World War. Just the following day, the Japanese wanted to further expand their power and influence, and to do this, they attacked the then U.S.-controlled Philippines. On the 8th of December 1941, the Japanese, commanded by Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, began their attack by carrying out bombing raids in the air before sending in ground troops. Before they knew it, the U.S. forces led by General Douglas MacArthur and the Filipino forces were on the retreat as the Japanese were storming toward the capital of the Philippines, Manila. Now on the 22nd of December, the Allies were forced back to the Bataan Peninsula to the west of Manila, and by April they were stuck there. As food and supply lines were stretched too thin, the Allies were forced to surrender or else face total destruction. After their surrender, the Japanese forced the estimated 60,000 to 80,000 U.S. and Filipino forces, now prisoners of war, to march up the island of Luzon, starting from Mariveles in the south up to Camp O'Donnell in the north. To do this, the POWs would have to walk almost 60 miles to San Fernando, where they'd take a train to get to Capas, and from there walk the remaining 10 miles. The POWs suffered from inhumane conditions at the hands of the Japanese, who actively shot, stabbed, tortured, or otherwise attacked the prisoners, physically and psychologically. There were even some cases where Japanese vehicles, including tanks, ran over the Americans and Filipinos. Starvation was rampant, as only some prisoners received any food at all. Dehydration and disease were common as well, partly because the Japanese did not allow any bathroom breaks, forcing the prisoners to defecate and urinate while marching, increasing infections and sickness. On top of these already brutal conditions, the sun was constantly beating down on the men, who were sometimes forced to sit in the sun as a method of torture. Due to these factors, the men were often tired and weak, and those who stopped, slowed down, or otherwise didn't keep up were killed by the notorious Japanese buzzard squads, who followed the prisoners, waiting to pick off those unfortunate enough to fall behind. Once the POWs reached their first destination of San Fernando, they were jammed into boxcars on the train with no windows, ventilation, or room to sit, causing more fatalities. Now in Capas, the prisoners marched the near 10 remaining miles to Camp O'Donnell, where they would face further painful and sometimes fatal harm at the hands of the Japanese Empire. It is estimated that around 10,000 U.S. and Filipino prisoners were killed or had otherwise perished during the process of the march. The aforementioned Homma, the man in charge of the Japanese forces responsible for the march, was found guilty of breaking the international rules of war and was executed in 1946. The Bataan Death March, as it is now called, was one of the worst war crimes committed by the Japanese during the Second World War. Thanks for watching.